Peace and blessings, family. Happy Thursday. I have the distinct pleasure of sitting here with a young woman who is brilliant, who is bold, and who is really, really capable of being the next city council member for District 4, correct? 4. I've been doing so many districts. Welcome, Miss Katie. I'm gonna get this last name right. Valenzuela.
Perfect.
Woo! I love it when I'm
Very
working on
nice.
some stuff. So welcome. Thank you for coming in and sitting down and talking with me about your run for this seat.
Thank you for having me.
And I got to say congratulations because BWAPA just endorsed you.
Yes, I'm very
And
excited.
I think that's awesome. BWAPA is Black Women Forum for Political Action. And they do, as you'll know here, we'll be going over the voter guide with them in the Sacramento Sister Circle on, who they recommend to vote. And they endorse this dear sister. So we want to know who she is because I think we need to definitely take that information you get and take it to the polls and vote for the right person so we can make some changes in our city of Sacramento. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
So who are you? Who is Katie?
The existential.
Yeah, who are you?
I'm just an organizer. I started doing stuff when I was 13 years old and my dad didn't want me staying at home. And this is just all I know how to do, is get involved, do the difference. And I got to college and realized I could actually do that for a living, working at nonprofits and doing that stuff. So I've been doing that in Sacramento for 10 years now. And my day job now, I do environmental justice policy at the state level for a nonprofit. Wow. Yeah. And I've been building here in Sacramento for several years, and it was time to level up and take it to the next step.
So before we get into the candidacy, what is the environmental? You're the second young person who came and sat in this seat running for office and talked about environmental issues. And sometimes we'll be talking about all this other stuff, which is just as important. But environmental is so important. You can't even breathe and get up and fight for anything if the air ain't right, if where you living at is,
your water.
Your water's messed up. Why that area?
I grew up in Oildale, a town in Kern County in the Central Valley. And I think for me, environmental justice is different than environmental work typically. Environmental work, you have a lot of more like well-meaning, affluent white folks, polar bears, seals, which is important work. But environmental justice is really talking about the intersection of race and environmental pollution, like why certain communities are more likely to have the natural gas power plant I was just talking about over here on 47th, or why more communities are more likely to have the warehouse that's right next to the natural gas power plant than others. It really is a legacy of segregation, a legacy of race. And what we're trying to do in environmental justice is confront that by building power in communities of color and lifting up those voices.
Okay. So what made you run for the office?
Oh, gosh. I got real frustrated. Near the end of last year, we were coming out to city council trying to talk about rent, and we were young professionals. The idea was that, let's bring out young professionals. So we were just like, look, we're making good money and we're still having trouble figuring out how to pay rent in Midtown. And I was out there with them a couple times and shared my story and about how I was in my housing situation. And shortly thereafter, the person I'm running against, Steve Hansen, proposed this non-binding mediation proposal for rent. So if a landlord wanted to increase the rent, you could ask for a mediator to come in and talk about it, but the landlord could still increase the rent to whatever they wanted. And it's a proposal that, I know your face is looking like our face, because we're like, wait a minute. But like, you have a mediator come in, but the landlord can still increase the rent. So like, what are they mediating?
Right.
And they've tried it in 2 cities in the Bay and it doesn't work. And like at that point, at the end of last year, I was like, okay, you're not doing this about us. Like, this isn't about us. You have more renters than any other city council member on the dais right now. Like, this is about doing something else to try to appease us, but you're not really looking for a solution. And by then I was over it. I was ready to start talking about running. But that was not the first time that I'd had that moment. My moments with Steve Hansen started shortly after he got elected and started approving the arena CEQA and didn't have any plan for traffic, which is like Carmageddon, and they paid for it all with parking and said, don't worry, we won't increase enforcement. And then look what happened. Wow. It was with Black Lives Matter. After it was really Joseph Mann was the one that I don't know if you recall or if you were there when the people showed up after the police videos came out showing they were basically trying to run over this man who was having a mental health breakdown, and the people came out, they were upset, and Steve from the dais said something about along the lines of how disappointed he was in the decorum of the audience that night. And
Wow.
I remember just being like, I'm sorry, what? Like, so there's been several instances where I just felt like time and time again he demonstrated that he wasn't really fighting for us. So for me, by the end of last year, things are getting so crazy in Midtown and downtown right now. I'm like, it's time to throw down and see if we can do something about it.
So what is your platform?
My platform, I mean, simply put, my platform is the slogan of like a Sacramento for all of us. I really think that our council has lost track of the people who live here. They don't really seem to be making decisions about what's in our best interest. They seem to be doing it for other reasons or to attract investment or development or what have you. But I want Sacramento to remain a place where we all can be and thrive and to continue building off of all the great work in the communities. But it really also comes down to, for me, accountability. And I say that a lot when I'm out in the community because I'm like, this is so central to me for everything, where we spend our budget money, how we make decisions, who you're spending time with, who you're meeting with. That should all be very public and transparent. Mm-hmm. So you should know, like, everything I'm doing on my time as a council member, you should know what I'm doing. So you can say, okay, that aligns with what I'm thinking. Or, hey, wait a minute, why are you spending all this time meeting with those developers over here? Like, we think that you should, like, what's going on with that? And the budget was a huge piece of it. I actually took a really unpopular position last cycle when I opposed Measure U. And I opposed the Measure U extension for the main reason of I was worried that they were going to say, this is your money, and they never answered the question about where the rest of the money went. I said, we have a $1.2 billion budget. Like, I'm not against taxing myself if we need it, but show me where the rest of the money goes. Mm-hmm. And they kept saying, don't worry about it. That's a separate issue, or we'll talk about it in the budget, which they never did. And then what happened just a few months after Measure U passed, we're all fighting over $40 million. And I'm like, wait a minute, but like the whole budget's our budget. Like, where's the rest of the money? So, I mean, I feel like our cities just really needs to get back to basics when it comes to being accountable for how we spend our money, how we spend our time, and what we're really doing at the city to make things better for everybody here.
Right on. Okay, but where did the other money go?
Did we ever find out where it went? No, we still don't know really where it went. So they cannot even tell you, Rhonda, how the money breaks down by council district. Like, if you ask them, so we started asking for a lot of detail, and then it got to the point where I'm like, can you at least tell me how much money is spent in like District 4 versus District 8, right? Can we at least get to that level? They cannot. They can tell you how many full-time employees work for neighborhood services, but they can't tell you if that means that like the community center in Del Paso is open longer, or we added this new programming in the downtown. Like, they can't tell you any of that, and we've been fighting for that, and it just was incredible to me that. So a lot of the ways they move money is on the consent calendar, and so they don't really talk about it. They just pass it at the beginning of every meeting. When you piece through that, in the first 2 months of this year, they moved $40 million. And I didn't get past the first 2 months because it took me I didn't realize I'd be doing that much work, so I kind of got stuck after the first 2 months. But some of those things, it was like $500,000 for improvements at City Hall. $100,000 that they took out of the general plan update that they moved over to the rail yards. And like, these things to me are policy decisions. Like, why are you investing $500,000 in City Hall when you say you can't afford a bathroom for the homeless individuals who don't have any place to go to the bathroom in the central city? Like, that is a value statement. And I think that's something that deserves more discussion and transparency.
What will be your plans for confronting housing and the homelessness crisis? Like, that's major.
It's major. It comes up 8 times out of 10 when we're at the doors. That's the first thing that comes out of people's mouths. And I think obviously the triage, some of the proposals that other council members have finally brought forward that we've been asking for years on tiny homes, on bathrooms, on safe camping, like, must be done right away so we can just triage the situation where it's at. I think the next step, though, it has to go beyond shelters. And that's been my frustration with our conversation, is that, shelters are temporary. Shelters are people rotate in and out. What we really need are the transitional units for, like, half the women on the street are coming out of domestic violence situations. Like, we don't have transitional spaces for those women to go to so that they don't end up having to choose between staying with an abuser or going to the street. Those sort of units for mental health individuals who have mental health conditions. That could be any of us if the chips had fallen a different way. So, like, there's no place for them to go and get services. Or if you are addicted to drugs, like, I've talked to many homeless organizers who said there used to be beds. Yeah, there was a wait list, but there were beds that you could get into that could give you treatment, and those beds aren't around anymore. So, like, we need to focus on that more permanent. Oh, sorry, I hit my mic. We need to focus more on that permanent, like, supportive housing, the transitional units that both keep people off the street permanently, but also keep people from getting on the street in the first place.
Right on. So what would you do? Like, how could the city council impact homelessness? Because even when you go to City Hall, there's homeless people right outside the door.
There are. Obviously, like legally, a lot of this responsibility falls on the county, and there has to be a discussion with the county about like what is and is not happening, and how we could work together to try to make that better for all of us. But the city also has the resources, and it is impacting all of us, and we could be doing things like, we have surplus land. I don't know if you know this, but the city of Sacramento actually owns quite a bit of land. So does Regional Transit, so does SMUD. So all these public agencies own land, and state law actually says that when you have surplus land, if you're going to dispose of it, you've got to make it available to affordable housing. You've got to make it available to shelters and those sort of things. What the city of Sacramento has done historically is sold them to the highest bidder and just put a requirement that they be below market. Like, instead of 500,000, list them at 300,000. So like, we've lost those opportunities in that land, and there's a lot. It was 60 parcels at one point we were fighting. They were trying to dispose of in Oak Park and El Paso Heights, neighborhoods that are in desperate need of affordable housing. And those are big lots too. Like, those aren't teeny tiny like single family lots. Those are 6,000 square foot lots. And we had a whole letter. We were at SHRA, don't sell these lots, and they did to El Paso Homes, a Roseville based developer. And they granted, the homes are below market, and that's something, but what we really needed were apartments. What we really needed were more like duplexes and more dense housing, and really super affordable housing that an affordable developer like Habitat for Humanity could have done differently than El Paso Homes would have done, right? So those are the types of opportunities. I also helped start a nonprofit here called the Community Land Trust, which is pretty popular in a lot of other cities. We work closely with Oakland, where they have a pretty thriving community land trust. And what we do is essentially pull parcels out of the market. And so it's community owned. And then that way, just by keeping it out of that speculative market, like, you buy it for $200, maybe we agree on the resale value. When you sell, you're selling it back to the trust. And then we're selling it to the next family at that price. We're not interested in profit. So then we preserve affordability using really creative means, rather than just these artificial 40 or 50 years stay affordable and then go market rate. We keep it in the community forever. So I think there's a ton of those like really innovative solutions that the city could be leveraging, because we also know, as much as homelessness in and of itself, there's a population that really needs services and constant care. There's also a population of folks increasingly that really just need a place to live. And what we can do in terms of affordable, like, we have no requirement for developers to build affordable. They gutted that in 2013. And they never replaced it with anything. So like, there's a lot we could do to just increase the number of affordable units, which could help alleviate that pressure and give families options so they don't end up on the street. So
there's Kelly Cooper's on here. She said, how much work have you done before you thought about running for city council?
Oh, that's a great question. I moved to Sacramento in 2009, and right around that time, I joined a local coalition that was working on the Housing Inclusionary Ordinance. They're no longer around, unfortunately, but they were convened through the Sacramento Housing Alliance. After that, I actually went to work for the Housing Alliance, and since that time, I've just been engaged in. I always joke that I had the two jobs, like the job that paid my bills, which was through one of the local nonprofits. Yeah, whereas like I was doing the Urban Agriculture Coalition, I was doing like different Start Neighborhood associations in different parts of town, and then I had the stuff I did that I wasn't paid for through the Sacramento Neighborhood Coalition, starting the Sacramento Community Land Trust, all of that work that happened that I wasn't getting compensated for that I did. So I'm a little bit of, as I say when I mean that, like, this is just how I am. This is how I was programmed from a young age. Right. Like, I'm a glutton for community work. I love it. I could do it every day, all day, and I basically do. Right on. So for pretty much the last 10 years, I guess.
Right on. Which is very impressive. So before we get to the climate change, because we're going to talk about the climate change in Sacramento, because sometimes we really don't look at that sometimes as an issue, but it really is an issue, like the air quality. Like, all of this is an issue. But with the housing, do you have any plans for home ownership? Because I feel like when people can own their home and they acquire the equity in it, that changes your generational kind of being prepared for future generations, because you now 100%. Have equity in property that you own.
100%. Something you can borrow against in case of emergency. Yeah, and that's what's beautiful about the community land trust model, is it allows for home ownership. And so you can still own your home. Maybe you're not making market equity. Maybe we're saying it's like a 5% equity growth every year, but you're still building that wealth. And you're still also then preserving affordability, so the next family who moves in is going to benefit from that lower price.
Right on. Yeah. I did share that website. That's what you see me doing. And I also shared your website. and where they could contact you or follow up with you or even come to volunteer with you on this campaign. What has the feedback been from your community about you running?
Gosh, it has been overwhelming. I mean, we started walking in May with a survey. We really wanted to hear from folks early to help, I mean, I knew I wanted to run. My friends and family all knew they wanted me to run, but we're a little bit of a progressive bubble, so I wanted to make sure that made sense. And so we started walking around and heard pretty consistent frustration. People were really frustrated. One of the words that my volunteers used was like restless. Folks are really they're anxious about what's happening in Sacramento right now, and they really, District 4 is incredibly engaged. I mean, they're in the Central City, it's Land Park, it's Natomas. I mean, these are folks who call the council, who go to City Hall for meetings, and they've been frustrated with the lack of responsiveness. They've been frustrated feeling like there's easy solutions here that aren't being taken, that we want to see the city pursue. One example was like in South Natomas, and they just had an article about this in the SAC-B where a gentleman just started paying for a porta potty along the river. Like they just got so frustrated. He's like, this is about me being able to use it recreationally, but also about like there's folks down here who need a place to go to the bathroom, couldn't get the city to move, so he just paid for it. And I had all these residents in South Natomas being like, gosh, we're grateful he did that, but it's kind of crappy that was necessary, like, and that sort of sentiment is like they're willing and they're doing a lot themselves, but they want a partner in the city, and they feel like the city isn't really taking their needs and concerns seriously. So it's been a lot of excitement. Folks are really interested to learn more about me, and I'm a very different person than our current council member, both personality-wise and just background. So it's been incredibly positive, just overwhelmingly positive.
Right on. Climate change. How would you take the lead on climate change for Sacramento?
So one of my nightmares, and I will say this quite frankly, and I don't want to freak out everybody who's watching online, but we have no emergency plan in Sacramento for smoke or flood. We have no emergency plan. So you remember last year, gosh, it was just a year ago when we had the big fire in Paradise and all the smoke was coming into Sacramento, and you had Sac City saying one thing, county saying another thing, take your kids to school, don't take your kids to school, the school air quality is actually worse, but what if the home air quality is worse? And we realized really quickly in an urgent situation that we had no strategy. And that to me was such a blatant abdication of responsibility. It's actually in state law that like when you update the general plan, you're in the safety element, you're supposed to start creating these plans. I know because my day job, we've sponsored legislation to add on language access, to add on cultural relevancy to those requirements. So Sacramento doesn't have a plan for emergency, and that terrifies me. Forget if you don't have a car, forget if you don't speak English. If a flood warning came for this weekend, how would you get out of the central city? Where would you go to? Like, what are the options for you? How would you know where to look for information? Would you go to Facebook? Is that our plan? Like to just post and have everybody post and hope that people know where to go to be safe? Like I have said many times that I worry that like we would be New Orleans and Katrina. Like if something happened tomorrow, that like we have such high level of risk and so little planning and strategy. That it really bothers me that as a pretty engaged environmental person that I have no idea what I would do when I get out of the city, much less what my neighbors would do who aren't that engaged and don't know how to call. So for me, like the first thing I really want us to do in Sacramento is develop those like really great plans that are inclusive, that reach people who don't speak English, where we know in the case of something urgent happening, whether it's fire or flood or smoke or what have you, that we have a way to get the information to folks, and folks have a way to deal with what they need to deal with to be safe. That to me is a way, because we're such a diverse community, we could really lead on that in California and show other jurisdictions what's possible and how we could do that work. Like I heard an idea from someone in the Central Valley as mayor of a really small rural town, and his idea was he wanted these solar bus stations that had AM radios, and so people knew, like he just wanted to be able to tell people if something's happening, go to that bus station, like if the power's out or whatever, and you'll be able to hear what's going on. Like that radio will be able to be turned on, and we'll tell you, hey, wait here and we're going to come pick you up in the bus and take you someplace safe, or like, hey, this is where you can go to get the masks or whatever it is that you need. And it was kind of a rudimentary idea, but also in that context probably would have been really effective, like because that doesn't contain our trees, all of these things that we really reduced when we were in the recession, that we never really brought the level of service back up, that could really help us not only improve quality of life and give people places of refuge, but also make us more environmentally sound for the future.
Okay, so with that being said, somebody's question was, what would you do with budget and policy?
Oh, budget. I really want to put all the cards on the table, and I know that will take time and it'll take resources, but I remember, so for example, if you've ever been to one of those budget workshops, I went to some of the ones they started a couple years ago, and they show you this pie chart, and like there'd be a wedge, and they'd say, this is the money we spent on transportation. And I remember raising my hand and saying, okay, in that wedge, like, is that citywide? Is that just my community? Is that streets? Is that sidewalks and bike lanes? Like, what can you tell me about where that money goes? Couldn't tell me anything. Just said, this is how much money you spent on transportation. So like, I really think that the level of information and engagement we could have would be so much improved if we worked on getting that data from the departments and making more of a public process there. There are cities who, like Boston has this thing called city data, I believe, and it's actually metrics. So the community has set metrics for like levels of service, like ambulance response time. You know, if I call 911, we want this ambulance response time, and it's updated daily. It's updated weekly and monthly, and they're saying, here's how we're doing. When you said, you know, you wanted dumping picked up within like 2 business days, here's how we're doing. And like, this is the city of Boston, you know, like that's a much like bigger and more complicated city than we are. And so I would love for us to start setting like certain expectations for communities. You know, your streets are swept twice a month, you know, everybody has a community center, everybody's got a park, you know, and really start measuring where we put our money based on those basic measures that we identify as a community. Because I think we could say, and I've heard city staff say, they know there's some communities, you call an ambulance, you're going to get one in 5 minutes or less. You call an ambulance in another part of town, maybe 20 minutes. And like those sort of equities, like it doesn't necessarily mean taking from one community to give to another, but it does mean that there's obvious opportunities to invest more in certain communities. Like Southside Park, like it's in the middle of Central City. You've got like the CV Circle, New Helvetia right across the street. They've got all that huge park, the pool, and they've got a community center that's closed. It's not open, and it hasn't been open for the last, I think, 10 years. And so like to say, okay, every neighborhood should have a place for kids to go after school where there's staff, where there's resources, where they can be safe and have people around to help them with stuff. Like that to me is the sort of thing that every neighborhood should be able to define for themselves, and we should expect the city to invest accordingly.
We'll talk. What about equity? And what about investing in our future? So we know we have the Sacramento Kids First. I think that's coming up. What are your thoughts on that? And
I love that. I love it because it's like the first thing we cut when we're in a recession are the services to kids. And it's like those are the very people, the individuals that need those supports the most. Like we know that the kids who don't get those free services and the families who can't afford to make up for that difference. I mean, like that's a huge equity challenge. I'm a huge supporter of Sac Kids First. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to think about where we cut in other places before we cut things to kids and youth. But yeah, I think that's another thing for me with the budget is I really want like racial impact assessments and neighborhood impact assessments. Where we spend our money is the biggest reflection of our values that I can think of, you know. And if we're not like really analyzing where that money goes and who's benefiting from that money by ethnic group, by racial group, by community, it's really hard for us to understand when communities may need more resources, when we may need to correct that balance if we're not even looking at the data. And that's a huge thing for me. But in general, I really think our city has a very flawed theory of change when it comes to economic development. Like we think that if we give a big incentive to a big developer, then that's going to benefit everybody. It's like trickle down economics, right? Like, oh, we're all going to benefit from the arena, right? Like, oh, we're all going to benefit from the soccer stadium. I even had the finance director told me a couple months ago, oh, we're all going to benefit from the riverfront, not just District 4. And I literally looked at her and said, how? And she kind of gave me this look like, well, I mean, everybody can go to it. And I was like, how? So I think I really want to see us focus in on the small local businesses. There's a ton of businesses that are operating out of folks' homes, out of their garages, out of like little like spots here and there. If we really build that economy, research shows time and time again that when you have that really broad base of small local businesses, you withstand recessions, people make more money because you're paying people more fairly. Like you're more able to withstand the ebbs and flows of the larger economy because you're investing in the people who are living and working here. And that's what I'd really like to see. Like I met with the developer for the Centene, the big development that the city gave a lot of incentive towards, and he said, oh, I'm sure you're mad at me for that. And I said, not so much. It's just I wish the city would do that for the small local businesses who are having trouble paying for rent downtown right now. And he kind of stepped back and was like, that's fair. Because it is fair, right? I'm like, you give Centene and you give like Amazon, like remember they were rolling out $400 million worth of investments for Amazon. I'm like, wait a minute, like you've got small businesses here who can't even get permits to do like their interior changes so that they can open. Like I've heard so many stories from small business owners that say time and time again how they've called, they haven't gotten the response they needed, they haven't gotten the resources, the city says there's nothing I can do, and I don't find that acceptable. I think that should be our primary focus and where we drive our investments, not to billionaires who honestly could afford it, like with the $27 million with the stadium. Like, I just really fundamentally disagree with that decision because that is money that's spread out across local businesses, would have made much more longer term beneficial impact on our communities.
Well, Kuba, who is the president of BWAPA, Black Women Organized for Political Action of Sacramento, says she's happy to, BWAPA is happy to endorse you as a bold leader focused on equity and justice.
Yes.
So she wanted to give you that shout out.
Thank
you. That's so awesome. We're all excited about that. How would you make sure, though, that because if you become the city council person, studies say that when women are involved more in leadership roles, is more of a balance.
Mm-hmm.
How do you propose to do that when you get to the city council?
Yeah, I daydream about this sometimes, especially when I get stressed on the campaign trail. It's like, oh, it's going to be so beautiful. I think, so, I mean, my background in community development and what I do and how I practice my work in my volunteer roles and in my paid roles, really about lifting up community voices. What I'm really hopeful is that once I'm elected, I can make decision-making more accessible to folks, really bring people in, have more community meetings, have different ways for people to provide input outside of coming to City Hall at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, which, by the way, I definitely want to get rid of those meetings if I can help it.
What would you replace them with?
After hours meetings and like more weekends. Like, I think there should be an expectation that before a decision is voted on at City Hall, that a certain level of engagement in the community has occurred, especially among those who are impacted by the decision. I mean, I remember when they were voting on the rent stabilization and the anti-rent gouging stuff they did a few months ago. I mean, it was at a 2 p.m. meeting at City Hall, and I'm like, well, most renters who are directly impacted by this, like, I couldn't go. I was at work. We had a big event the next day. I just couldn't get out, and I was like, this sucks. So that's one thing I really want to do, is use the privilege of the information and the knowledge that I'm able to gain from staff and from being a council member to really try to help the community understand what's happening so that they can have a meaningful voice in that process. But I'm also like not totally naive to think that as one voice I'm going to be able to change one of 9. Like I hope that I'll have allies, and I'm hopeful for those partnerships, but I'm also not naive. So my just long decade of working and organizing in these communities, groups like BWAPA, groups like other groups that have held, like Sunrise Sacramento, like, I mean, all these different clubs and individuals who've endorsed me in this race, that working together we can do a really effective inside-outside organizing. So like when we were doing the urban agriculture ordinance, we knew we wouldn't have the votes. As much common sense as it made that people should be able to grow and sell food in their community, that shouldn't, like, it was pretty obvious. And we knew we didn't have the votes. And so we were very thoughtful about reaching out to gardeners and building those relationships across the council district. So when we were worried about Alan Warren, if we were worried about Larry Carr, we had gardeners and advocates in those council districts that were hitting and saying, no, we want this. And that's what got that through. It wasn't because it was a good idea. It was because we thought ahead and had that base organized across all those council districts. And so I imagine that when I'm elected, it's going to still be a similar dynamic where I'm going to need groups like BWAPA and others to help me strategize and think through how we put pressure on the rest of the council. If there's something the community wants, how do we get that done? Because we really have a lot of incredible opportunity in Sacramento that I'd really like to see us start taking more advantage of and building on.
So when you become a city council member, how can regular, everyday folks help you to carry out your mission? Because sometimes we'll send you to places and they'll be like, she in there, we can take a break. And it's like, no, it don't work like that. What can we do to help you?
Yeah, I'm never going to take a break. I mean, that's as much as I can over email and on social media and to have these community meetings, but I really need folks to tell me when I'm off. To tell me when I'm on, to tell me what, like, hey, wait a minute, that idea you had, like, it's not quite there yet, and I've got some ideas. I don't want anyone to ever shy away from calling or emailing or texting. Like, I'm hoping to keep all, like, the emails and phone numbers we've created through this open so folks can really access us and keep telling me when, hey, this thing happened, and you said that you were going to deliver this, and, like, I don't see the timeline here. What's the deal? And, like, hold us accountable to that bold vision of engagement, because it's, I'm not underestimating the challenge we have ahead of us on this council. It's pretty entrenched, and there's a lot of interests in this city that are pretty entrenched. So it's going to take folks continuing to push that envelope and sometimes be there to say, no, that's still not good enough. And I'll be the first one to say, you're right. But here's how we can build towards that. So yeah, staying engaged and keeping it true, and being willing to throw down with me when it's time to throw down. A big reason why I decided to run also was, I thought about running earlier when I was in Sacramento, and I didn't because I didn't really see the level of organizing in the community that made me feel like I would have backup. Like I thought, okay, I could win, maybe run a good campaign, and then what if folks don't turn out to support? What if like we're trying to push rent control and nobody's there to help me? Like I won't be able to do this by myself. And now, I mean, obviously due to a series of unfortunate events with police shootings and with all this just really terrible stuff that's happened in our community, there's a level of activism here that's always been there, but I think is starting to really hit that stride, and I see a lot of that foundation, and I hope that I can help continue to do whatever I can to partner and build that, because that's what's going to make me effective. Is the more we build that voice in the community, the easier and the better it's going to, more effective I can be in that role by saying like, look, it's not just me, Crazy Katie, thinking of this. I want to do what Boston does, like crazy idea. It's like this is a community that's pushing for more accountability for how our money is spent. Yeah.
So as we wrap this up, this has been an awesome interview. We got a chance to we're going to definitely see more of you. Are you going to the candidate forum with the women and girls?
Yeah, on the 8th. Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
I'll be there.
I'll be working on that too. So I'm glad you're going for that, because I just think we need to really get out there and support you and know who you are and ask those questions. You're very obtainable. Like people can touch you like you're a real person. So, family, I share with you her website, her information around the Sacramento Community Land Trust, which I think is awesome. So we're talking about homelessness and housing, but we need to be talking about home ownership and things like that. I want you to look into this camera right here and tell people why they should vote for you. Why are you the choice for District 4, Sacramento City Council?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts just popped in my head at the same time. But I think, I love this city. I love the people that I've met since I've moved here. I've loved the work that I've been privileged to do. And now is the moment. I think that the change that we're feeling in Sacramento, that moment that's here, we're really at a precipice where we choose a different path. If we continue on this path that we're on, this city is going to become fundamentally different. It's not going to be the city that we know and love, and it's going to be harder for us to build that equitable vision that we want for Sacramento. This moment, this year, this election is really critical for that. We are sending a message that's going to reverberate well beyond the District 4 seat and well beyond Midtown, Downtown, Land Park, and South Potomac. This is about the future that we want for Sacramento, and showing them that by, like, you can not take developer money, you can run a grassroots campaign, you can challenge an incumbent, and you can have a shot if you're doing it for the right reasons. And I just think there's so much we can do with this election. I've never believed that more. I mean, I jumped into this knowing that I wanted to do this, and the more I've canvassed and the more people I've talked to, the more I know that we need a fighter. We need to fight for this city, and this election has become about that. So whether you're in District 4 or interested in canvassing, or I don't know, maybe you have some spare change laying around that you want to throw my way, this is the moment that we can show them that it doesn't matter what size your bank account is, or who's endorsed you, or what is going on, and what your pedigree is, and what degrees you have, that if you're like, we want someone from our community who's going to fight for us.
Wow. She said a mouthful, family, and that is so true. No matter the endorsements, no matter who you think you're coming up against, if the people is behind you, you can win. And so if you're interested, I share with you her website. Please reach out to her. She's very, very capable of being a city council member. So I share the information, and I will be back with you all in a couple of days with another podcast and a live. Peace, family. Good evening.